Welcome to the Being Human UT podcast, where Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus will discuss issues relative to the humanities and technology at Utah Tech University. And now your hosts for Being Human UT podcast, Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigus.
Welcome to the Being Human Utah Tech podcast. We are back from spring break. I'm Randy Jasmine, and I'm here with my co-host, Jim Hindigus, who has put together a wonderful podcast for us and has a wonderful guest for us. Jim, let me turn it over to you. Tell us what's going to be happening on this episode.
Well, we have a wonderful guest. We have Dr. Kristin Arola, who it happens to me. I'll just put this out up front. Was a member of my dissertation committee, and so everything that is me is because of her.
Okay,
it's a lot of pressure. No, but Kristin worked. I'll let you introduce yourself, but I mean, what was always really impressive to me about you was that you had a real strong connection to that sort of technological wave of rhetoric and composition. And you went to Michigan Tech, correct? And that was sort of this sort of flashpoint where people started to really look at what digital rhetoric was and what, how do we look at composition and rhetoric from a really 21st century lens. And so it was really cool to work with you. And so we've got you. So introduce yourself.
All right, I will. I'm happy to be here. I'm Kristin Arola. I laugh when I go to introduce myself, especially Jim, when you mentioned where I went to grad school, because I'm like, oh God, how far back do I go? I was born in a small town. I'll tell you where I'm currently at, and then maybe some highlights along the way. So I'm currently the Gilmore Endowed Associate Professor of Public and Professional Writing at Michigan State University, where I also serve as the interim director of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. Before that, I was at Washington State University when I served on Jim's committee, and I was at Washington State. Go Cougs! I will always say go Cougs. It's fun to say. Mm-hmm. I was there for 11 years, and while I was there, I directed an undergraduate program in digital technology and culture, and then I was a grad director kind of near the end of my time there. But that program in digital technology and culture was really kind of a bringing together. I don't know if I could ever quite get as perfect again of the bringing together of the things I'm interested in and do, because when I got my PhD in 2006 from Michigan Technological University, it was, as Jim mentioned, kind of just a flashpoint moment in the field. My PhD's in rhetoric and technical communication. I was in a humanities department. I was working with people who were rhetoric professors, composition and writing studies, worked in the writing center. And at that time, especially kind of coming out of the 90s into the 2000s, folks were just really interested in how does technology change the way we teach writing? Like that was sort of the big question. And some of those early articles are people just simply talking about like, how does the word processor change how we teach students to write, which I like to get my students to think back to sometimes because we don't think about it anymore, right? We just write on screen. But I'm like, how did that change from typing to a word processor? It changes a lot. So I was working with folks who were kind of at the forefront of that moment in the field of thinking that through, and then that moves into pretty quickly, right, into students can have a web presence. What is the web? What does it mean that students are on the internet and writing on the internet? Maybe they have a blog, and perhaps they have a website, or maybe they're using this new fangled thing called MySpace. What does that mean by their writing? And for me, I've always been interested in pedagogy, right? Like, how do we teach things to students, particularly around communication and persuasion? And for me, I've always been interested in the cultural component of that, which is kind of manifested in different ways throughout my career. Sometimes I've looked more at like how gender dynamics of communicating in online spaces. My mom is a member of the Aquinnah Indian community, Lake Superior Band of Chippewa Indians, also known as the Ojibwa, also known as the Anishinaabe, people of Great Lakes region, and I'm a descendant of the tribe. And so I've also always been interested in like American Indian culture and ways of knowing too, and the ways that impacts who we teach, how we teach, what we teach in technology. So that's maybe a shortened version of sort of like who I am, some of the questions that I was brought up with in my kind of academic discipline, but also the ways those things kind of have ebbed and flowed over my career.
Well, and I think we're going to unpack some of the things that you mentioned. I mean, that was a great overview because I have a few questions for you that I think really dig into a lot of those, what you have accomplished and what you've gone through in your career. And the first question I have for you is sort of, you've seen, I think we asked this question of a lot of people, is that you've seen sort of the change in the type of student, what they experience with technology, what the classroom looked like in the 90s, which a lot of our students don't understand what the classroom looked like in the 90s. So you've seen this technological change. What do you think are the most important technologies that are impacting students now, and maybe what was impacting them in the past?
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I rarely anymore, when I introduce myself, say that I do work with technology or digital technology. And it's not that I don't, it's that it's become so enmeshed in sort of the fabric of everything we do that sometimes I don't think to say that part out loud. If that makes sense. Even in the early 2000s and even kind of going into the teens to a point, I felt like sometimes I had to distinguish that from, say, other types of writing instruction. But now it's just so folded in that I sometimes don't think to disarticulate it. That being said, when I think to your question, Jim, the important things that students do communicate with now, it's funny. I was reflecting on this question before we started talking today, and it's less. Of course, there's AI, and I know we're going to talk about AI, and that's like we can't not talk about it.
We try to avoid it, and then it just always comes up.
I know, it comes up. That aside, if we can push it aside, I think increasingly for me, it's asking students not so much what the technology is they're using, but how can they be flexible in the spaces that they're confronted with, and also how can they kind of understand just the networks of those spaces. And I don't mean that they need to understand like back-end computing, right? But I do think students really do need to understand simple things like you're sharing a Google Drive on a team you're working on. Where do you put something? Why do you put it there? How can someone else on the team find it? Or you end up having to shift over to using Microsoft Teams for another thing. Okay, what does that look like? How do you put something there? You need to ping your boss to do something. Like, how do you best? So it's like those best practices of figuring out all these online systems that students are writing in, communicating in, trying to problem solve in. Because it changes from workspace, from class to class, especially, at least I know for us at Michigan State during the pandemic, we had a whole year we were online here, and everyone sort of branched out, right? We're supposed to use, we use something called D2L, Desire to Learn, as our main content management system, but a lot of teachers started using Google Classroom. Others started using Microsoft Teams Classroom. And so these poor students, right, are having to navigate like all these different content management systems in order to just get to the point of doing the work of the class. So there's like a lot of this process-based just understanding of technologies. And for me, that's actually the most important thing for my students to take away, is like being able to do this sort of like landscape, like this moment of, okay, what's the space I'm in? What's the context? Who am I communicating with? How am I going to best do that work so that we can like form a community of shared knowledge and working to solve problems together.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up question on that. You touched on some things that we've talked about here. Does this also connect, well, as you were speaking, it kind of popped into my mind with what I've found with these various systems and various places to send your work and save your work. Do you find that you have to put an increased stress on saying you still have to think of this as, there comes a point when you have to think about this as a finished product. and again, maybe this is me being old fashioned, but when you hit that print button, when it used to be a hard copy that was expected, you knew that it had to look polished. You knew that it had to look finished. And I'm just thinking in my experience that sometimes in my course management system, I get final drafts of papers and they still have, comments pinned to them from the round of peer review and revised draft. So do you find you have to put extra emphasis on that product after the process is over?
Yeah, it's funny because I just encountered that in something literally today where I got something from someone, and it was actually a professional thing. It wasn't a student thing. It was in my service life, but someone sent me something with comments on it, but they didn't mean to. So it was actually a colleague. I was like, they didn't mean to do that. And I think that it's this fast-paced thing, right? I think sometimes and this can go we can get into asking students, why didn't you run spell check? Why didn't you, remember to put page numbers on it? Why didn't you remember to remove the comments? And I think so much of that is just this, just this fast pace, like get it in, do it, turn it in, move on to the next thing, and finding ways of asking students to slow down, to take a breath, to think about the thing they're doing. It's hard because they're busy, right? I don't know what your student body looks like, but often I've got students who are working jobs and involved in other organizations, and telling them, like, just take 5 minutes, take a breath, like, look at the thing you're turning in. Is it the right version? Did you run the spell check? Did you do the things? And for me, that's the human component of teaching, and that's my favorite part of teaching, no matter what I teach, is connecting with students and kind of reminding them those things that transcend classrooms. It's that sort of human awareness of being in the world with other people and showing them you care because you just remember to take the time to do something right to make their lives easier, right?
Well, and I think that's a good way to transition into AI in a lot of ways, because I keep hearing, about using AI as sort of, you're saving all this time, that, you're making the writing process more efficient. And the curmudgeon in me always kind of thinks, there's some of that time-consuming aspect that it was kind of a nice way of making the process work. I use an example, what I used to do in my undergrad, which is incredibly inefficient, but I did it, and I think it helped me kind of process ideas, is I used to write on 3x5 cards quotes that I would use in a paper. And what I would do in that, it's like, why would anybody, in this day and age, you would just cut and paste it and onto a Word doc or something like that. Helped me just slow down. It made me want to just, take the time to really think about, what am I trying to say in a paper? And I just worry that with students having access to such efficient tools, they won't feel like they can slow down. So what do you feel like with your experiences with AI or fast-paced technologies? How are you seeing the students being impacted by that kind of efficiency?
Yeah. And I think that, that for me is one of the biggest pieces of it. I rejected knowing about AI for about a year there. I'm like, I'm not going to play with it. I'm not going to do it. And I'm like, okay, Kristin, you need to actually mess around with ChatGPT and see what it can do. So I can't be an effective teacher if I can't see what it does. And so I've started messing with it a little bit off and on over this past school year, I guess. And what I notice, and the classes that I teach, it tends not to be as big of an issue just by nature of the types of classes that I teach. Because so many things that my students do are they're producing some sort of multimodal text that's a response to a very specific prompt. And they might be able to get some components of AI generated things in there, but not the whole thing. And then the writing piece is very much a response to the thing they made. So they have to say, why did you make these choices? They're justifying rhetorically the thing they did. And so you can't feed all of that into AI. It would take you so much time to do it that it wouldn't be worth it. That being said, I know that, a lot of other instructors are dealing with students doing this. And you can't, just like you can never stop plagiarism, and you can't stop, you're not going to be able to stop students from using AI. But I think what good writing teachers can do is, and my colleague, Bill Hart-Davidson, talks about this a lot. He's an expert in this. I'm a casual observer and tinkerer. He researches it. But what we can teach students to do is really pay attention to, and this goes back to something I said earlier about the affordances of the technologies you're using, right? So whether that's using a content management system or Google Drive or Microsoft Teams, what is it that AI can do for you well, and what can't it do for you well? I sometimes ask AI to generate administrative type texts for me, like, I need a mission statement for this particular thing I'm doing, and see what it spits out. But what I find is that it's a good first draft, and it looks like, if you're moving really fast, it looks sort of shiny, like, oh, those are the right words, and it feels sort of sexy and right. But then you look at it, you're like, but that's not really saying the thing I wanted it to say, and that's not really getting the part of me or the program or the mission of the thing. It's missing some component of something. And so I always have to do this work, right? I'm like, okay, that wasn't interesting first draft, but I got to cut this, I got to move this, those words aren't the right words I would use. And actually modeling that to students, I think, is really important, because it can show them why you might not want to use these pieces, what it does take to slow down. And in that slowing down, there's this process of thinking about, why are you using the tools you're using, in what ways, what does that afford you, what do you lose from doing that? I'm kind of a romantic about this, right? I understand that we live in a fast-paced society, and people like to use technologies that move really quickly and make things go really quickly, and sometimes that's just what happens. But you even see now that, some of these, I think it was today, Target has changed all their self-checkouts to, you have to be 10 items or less. Some of the Walmarts are getting rid of self-checkouts. Some Costco's are getting rid of self-checkouts, because it wasn't just the quickness, right, that was helping the company out. There was all sorts of other factors that just didn't quite work. And so I think sometimes we move to this quickness, but there's all these other things that get missed along the way. And I'm always hopeful, being in the humanities, right, and teaching my students, wanting to teach them the human part of what it is that we do, that if I can just, with AI, talk to them about what's possible, what's lost, how their voice and their sort of the things that they know from being in the world just simply can't be captured by a robot. Some things can be captured by a robot, but a lot of things can't. And talking with them about that is important.
And something I really like about what you're saying that I don't think we highlight enough is, so much of the communication process is about choices, about, including this versus not including that. It's not, and you have to fight that often in education too. It's not about the right answer, which, especially in the humanities, we don't thrive off of, the correct answer. We thrive off of the argument that you crafted. And so much of that AI of, well, if I put in the right prompt and then it spits out the right thing, then I get the grade that I want, and then we can move on. And, if you can look at AI as a draft, as something that, okay, you jogged my memory, or you at least spurred some ideas on, but now I'm going to do something completely different. That was great. That was a great point that you made, robot. But I would like to rearrange a little bit of that. That makes education exciting to me, but then we have to sell that excitement to students.
Yeah. And I think sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. I think it's a little context dependent. It's dependent on that student's moment in their life, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes you get a student who's just having a really busy semester and they don't have the time to slow down, and that just is what it is. But other times you do have those moments and those students who are just in that space where they can hear that, and you can kind of help them move forward with that piece of education and just being like a critical human in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I wanted to change a little bit gears and talk a little bit about crosstalk. Now I wasn't sure, is the new edition, has it been out for a little while, or did it just come out, or what edition are we at? And could you just tell us a little bit about your involvement with crosstalk?
Yeah, so Crosstalk in Comp Theory is an anthology. So it's a collection of essays in composition studies and writing studies, specifically around the idea of gathering some of the key moments in the field and gathering voices that are having a crosstalk, that are talking to each other, maybe talking around certain issues. My former colleague and mentor, Victor Villanueva, he started the first edition of that by himself. It was a Victor project. And Victor did the first two editions, in fact, on his own, kind of updating it seems like every 5 to 10 years. He's like, oh gosh, the field is changing. We need to add something. He brought me in the third edition, which was back when I was at Washington State and working with him, to add a section specifically on technology because he felt like he was missing that component from the book. And now we just did a fourth edition that came out just in January. So
it was recent. Okay.
It's new. And that one was both revising some of that technology conversation while also just making sure to kind of add some more conversations that we've just sort of lost along the way, or as we go back, right, you notice certain things kind of come more, especially conversations around culture seem to be more in the field. And so we were making sure we were having some of those conversations folded in as well. So that's what the fourth edition is doing. And also you notice too, as you go through a discipline, and I think I've talked to other people who've done anthologies, no matter what their discipline is, you're trying to kind of mark and capture the big conversations, and some things fade. Some things that seem like a big deal that you wanted to anthologize in 2005 because in the 90s they were a really big deal. 20 years later, we're not talking about those things anymore. And so it's paying attention to who's still being cited, what conversations are being cited, what are kind of those canonical things that you need to understand in order to understand a discipline. But also what can you let go of? Because we're, bound by word limit and the sheer technology of book binding. You can only make a book so big, right? And so we always have to cut something when we add things. And that's actually one of the hardest parts, both cutting conversations, but also there's people behind those conversations. And so I'm always like, oh, if they're still alive, I'm sorry. We had to cut you.
Well, I have a special place in my heart for crosstalk because I don't know if you knew this, but I did my undergrad in literature and I sort of switched over to composition and rhetoric, and I was a little lost and kind of terrified. I knew enough about lit theory, but I just didn't know. And so I actually, if I can remember it right, I think Victor even just said, here, just read this. And it covers everything, and you'll be caught up by your first year of the master's. So it was a really important book for me. And then I found out you were working with him, and I thought, I guess at a certain point we were all thinking, well, everybody in rhetoric and composition were thinking, okay, I think probably we need to address some technology here. And so I'm glad you came on.
Yeah, and that was a hard section to put together as well because. When we were working on that, gosh, I wish I had the date in front of me. Maybe I do. It was probably around like 2010. I'm going to wager that third edition when we looked to add that section on technology. Even then, you're looking at 20 years of conversation. So trying to decide, like, are we going to include some of those early conversations about word processing, changing the field? There were so many technology-specific conversations. So there was this whole moment in our discipline of talking about moos and muds, which nobody knows what they are anymore, but it was like right. Kind of online platforms, right, for having conversation. And so we're like, well, that doesn't really make sense to include. So how do you kind of include these big picture things that people understand? And even again, when we went back to it this time, that took me a while to figure out because, like I mentioned earlier, in some ways the digital becomes part of like the warp and the woof of everything that we do. Or a lot of things that we do and teach. And so you're trying to find those moments that still kind of highlight these shifts, highlight these changes. Multimodality also ended up kind of getting lumped into that, which is this moment in our field where we really start talking about essentially technology gave us the ability, students, to change the way something looks at its bare minimum, right? They can choose a typeface, they can include an image, they can work with headers and spacing. And so maybe we should be asking students to think about the affordances of those kind of choices. And so there's this whole moment in our discipline, kind of this multimodal turn where people are thinking about those choices, which is very connected to technology. And so now in the fourth edition, the technology section, which is called Virtual Talk, Composing Beyond the Word, includes both the technology things, but there's also key moments in there, like Kathleen Blake Yancey had a 4Cs talk, which is the big conference in her discipline, called Lessons from History, Teaching with Technology. Oh, sorry, wrong one. Made not only in words, composition in a new key. That was her keynote at 4Cs, and that was a big moment in the field. Of like, well, let's include that one because she's talking about how we shouldn't just be teaching alphabetic literacy, we should be teaching visual literacy, and let's throw that in there. So just, yeah, I guess getting away from your question, Jim, or your comment, but I guess in the virtual, thinking about like what counts as digital, virtual, everything goes in there, so nothing goes in there. So what do we do? It was an interesting moment, especially putting this together in the past couple years to think that through.
Well, I'm glad that personally I teach a course in which, actually we didn't even mention that, but I can kind of plug this too. I use Writer Designer in one of my courses, and we talk about multimodality, and I'm so glad that hasn't been lost. I'm glad that sort of carries on and it kind of morphs with the different changes that we're having. And so it's just, you just talk about it in a different context, but it's kind of still exists. And so I appreciate that. Writer Designer is really, so if you haven't bought Crosstalk, then I feel like we're selling things now. Crosstalk, go get Writer Designer as well. But I appreciate that text as well that you do with Cheryl Ball and is it Jenny Shepard?
Jenny Shepard, yeah.
That text is really useful. In fact, it's fresh on my mind because I have to order textbooks today for the fall. But it is. I mean, I like what you're saying about the fact that we have to be really nimble about the different what we talk about in technology in our field, because there are things that I have done this before where I've put an article or some kind of topic in a class, and then I'm talking about it with the class or I'm prepping for the class, and then I realize at that moment they don't even know what this is. This is something that was kind of a big deal 10 years ago, but now they have no concept of what I'm talking about. And it's always kind of a sad aging moment, I feel, in my class.
Yeah. One of my first articles, it was a book chapter, was about MySpace. So I feel you.
I don't know how Facebook lasted this long, but MySpace was very short-lived in comparison.
I don't know. I think I tried, and I haven't taught that MySpace article in a long time, but I think I did at some point kind of early on when people had already, when it was dead. And I was trying to just talk about the larger takeaways, right? Which I think I always try to think about in technology. What are those larger takeaways? And you can probably hear from how I talk, and Jim mentioned Writer Designer, which is a textbook some folks I went to grad school with and myself put together, in large part based on the way we were raised, as it were, in graduate school, kind of being in this space that was really messing around with a lot of technologies and a lot of ways of envisioning teaching writing. But so much of that book and our approach to teaching communication is around the notion of choices. What choices are you going to make? Why are you making those choices? In what situations? What audiences are going to respond to certain choices over others? Do you want to make a video? Do you need to do a podcast? Are you making a brochure or a poster? Are you writing an essay? Are you writing a letter to the editor? Like, those all have very different ways of approaching them. They all have different affordances for the type of work they can do there. Well, but they have similarities too in thinking about just, we talk about ethos, pathos, logos in our discipline. It's just what are the major appeals you're going to use to someone? But those appeals can look different or sound different in a podcast versus a video cast, even, for example.
And one of the things I like, at least teaching it in an English course, is that you get a lot of students that they're trying something new. They're treading into these unknown waters, and with a discipline that often works with, I mean, in communications with podcast studios, in digital film, we have a major in digital film. That's their thing. I really like challenging English majors, people who just focus on the written word for the most part, to dabble in something that's multimodal, because it can be kind of exciting and be kind of terrifying and a little bit of both. I appreciate the text. It's living on. It's living on through 20-year-olds in my class.
That playing with things part that you mentioned is, I think, why I got drawn to multimodality, and it's the thing that I think we lose in fast-paced technologies and spaces. Sometimes we can, if the end goal is to just get something done, is that moment of lingering with trying to put something together, to play around with something, to figure out how you make something. So for, you're mentioning like asking students to say, make a video, and then being like, ugh, I don't want to do that, or I don't know how to do that. Like, I think those moments of discomfort, you can grow a lot. There was a moment in my research life that I sort of abandoned, because I think I realized it was more an exercise for myself than anything I really needed to write about. But I was looking at the crafting practices of women from my mom's tribe, because I was really interested in, like, how are they learning to bead, like, say, do beadwork, for example? Who taught them to do that? Is there a right way to do it? Is there a wrong way to do it? And I realized my kind of interest in that, and the conversations I was having with women about that, was really just like, I was trying to make the familiar unfamiliar for me when it came to writing. Like, I was trying to set these things side by side, writing and, say, beadwork, to just think, like, what does it mean when you're taught to do something new and someone teaches you to do a thing, and you have to, like, get your hands dirty, and you might prick yourself with a needle, and you might stumble over, and your first draft is going to look really messy, and you look at the beadwork of these experts and you feel sort of embarrassed and like a fool because you can't do it right, but you're also kind of proud because you did a thing and you sort of learned how to do a thing. It put me back in that space of feeling like a first year student in my writing class so many years ago, where I was learning all sorts of new ways of just expressing myself and trying to be a little more polished and trying to figure out how to talk this academic talk that was not the way I grew up, not the people I grew up with. It was just a different way of being. And so, yeah, I like that moment, Jim, that you say, like, asking my students to play around, to be a little uncomfortable, to be a little unfamiliar with the things that they're doing, but to push through it and see what comes of it.
I totally relate. I think it's kind of the reason why I've embraced a lot of drumming, and this portion of my academics is just sort of, I'm not a master musician, and so it kind of makes me uncomfortable, and I kind of like that. I like the fact, not that I'm a master academic, but it's at this point where it's a little bit more of a challenge to put myself in a space where I'm not comfortable, and I kind of like that. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the last things I wanted to ask you about, which you were kind of alluding to, was just your work with American Indian and Indigenous interfaces. Because I'm curious about that. We haven't had anybody talk about that, and I'd love to know more about what you're doing in that.
Yeah, I so much of what I'm doing with that lately is just boring administrative work.
Well, that's what it sometimes ends up being.
Yeah, but I have done some publishing and some research and some writing around those topics, and for me, a lot of it was just thinking about this intersection of technology, identity, affordances of communication. I had done this piece, and it's old now, but it was fun. It was sort of just I was at a powwow, and I was just asking people, like, what would Facebook look like if it was designed by and for American Indians? So I was asking American Indians, what would it look like? Because I was trying to get I was thinking through and troubling this notion that of universal design and the ways that can we design something that everyone can access in some way, or that everyone feels at home in, or that everyone sees themselves in. Like, is that even possible? Is that not possible? Is it? I've always had an interest in design. That was part of my dissertation work, was around design of interfaces and spaces. But through that question, and through that specific work and asking folks about it, what some people gave me answers like, oh, well, maybe if Facebook was designed by and for American Indians, it would include like eagle feathers, or include like a medicine wheel, sort of these like stereotypical things we think about when we think about American Indian design. But then at the end of the day, it seemed like most people ended up just saying like, well, it really comes down to what you do with it and what you use it for and who you connect with and how you connect with people. And I think that for me, there's tons of scholarship out there about like indigenous ways of knowing and being, and a lot of it really is a much more communal sense of being, kind of being in community, doing things for the good of the community, instead of the good of the individual. Thinking about things kind of in terms of this concept of seventh generation thinking, right? So any choice that you make in the present should be good for the seventh generation beyond you, which is a pretty profound way of making decisions, and can be sort of debilitating at times to think that way, but it's a useful exercise in thinking. And I think those sort of like communal-based, future-looking based ways of thinking and being are things that maybe can't be manifest in the design of an interface, but they can be made more possible through the ways that technologies might connect us or disconnect us, the types of things that technologies allow or don't allow, who's in those spaces, and what are they allowed or afforded to do in those spaces. The end result of what would Facebook look like with kind of all the data I got was that it wouldn't look any different. It would look the same, and it was just how the people used it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you kind of hit on a point that I was thinking about right as it was popping into my mind, this idea of when you hear people talk about, I'm actually someone who has avoided social media, actually did have a MySpace page, but learned quickly that this is not the kind of thing that I want. So by the time everyone was on Facebook, I was like, maybe I need to not do that. But when I talk to people about their experiences, it's almost always the communal experience is the positive thing that they talk about. And then the negative thing is, I spend too much time on it. I worry about how people perceive me, or I see someone whose life is great and I'm envious of that. And, I give them a hate like because of it. So it seems to me like when I hear people talk positively about platforms like that, it's the communal aspect that they talk about as being positive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is what my students all tell me, and I'm sure you hear this too, that Facebook is mostly dead for younger folks, Gen Z,
yes,
like whatever.
Yes.
And I'm like, but that's how I communicate. But I'm a Gen Xer, so I don't know. But it is also, I've noticed, and I don't want to, this is probably an overgeneralization, but I will say that at least where I'm located in the Great Lakes, that Facebook, it does tend to be the way that most Indigenous folks from this area share information about stuff that's going on.
Okay.
So if they want to share information about round dances coming up, or powwows, or a drum making workshop, or a speaker coming to town, or whatever, it's still really in that space. And I think part of the reason for that, I don't know this, my guess is part of the reason for that is because there is this communal sense. So you want to make sure the elders know about it, right? And the elders are on Facebook. They're not on Instagram necessarily. They're not on TikTok. And so if you want to have everyone included, you need to be there. And because these young folks are thinking about elders as part of the community, they stay there. That's not to say they don't also, I'm sure they also have a presence, right, in these other spaces with just their friends. But I think when they want to be in this community space, they go there, and they know that's where some of those things will be. I don't know, like I said, that may be an overgeneralization to my experience here in mid-Michigan and the lower Great Lakes, but I do see that trend of being in community in that space because of a recognition of people beyond one's own generation.
When I'll see your overgeneralization and raise you another overgeneralization by saying that sometimes, at least I thought that a lot of the younger generation left Facebook because of the antagonism, that just sort of, mom and dad or grandma and grandpa are just getting really angry about politics on Facebook. I just want to watch people dancing, and so I'll get on TikTok. And so I was curious, with this idea of community, do you think that especially American Indian groups, would they want a more or less antagonistic space? Because sometimes you can think antagonism is arguing, which can sometimes build community, but sometimes it obviously fractures community. Do you think that community involves antagonism, or do you think that community actually tries to remove antagonism?
Ooh, that's an interesting question that I do not have an answer to. Some of the different spaces I end up in, and it's variable. There's always argument, and I don't think any community is insulated from the larger social fabric that we're part of right now, which is incredibly antagonistic and incredibly divisive. So that for sure bleeds in, and that for sure you can see those flare-ups in spaces for sure. I think sometimes it's a little dependent on the topic, right, that people are talking about. And if it goes political, then it just goes south. But if it's about there's a community potluck, it's just right, a different space and a different way of being. But yeah, TikTok does feel much happier, doesn't it? Well, you can get, again, though, that depends how you use it, where you use it, who you follow, what you do with it, and what you do with that space. So it's, Cindy Self was one of my dissertation committee members, and she was kind of one of the godmothers of the discipline of computers and writing, which just kind of sounds like a funny old-timey term, but we still use it. Because people started writing with computers and things changed, as we talked about. But she always talked about being wary of notions of technological determinism. That is, never think that technology will necessarily determine what comes of people and possibilities. It can foster certain things, but that's not to say it's the end-all be-all. And so I think the human potential is always huge. And I never want to lose sight of that. And I always want to foster that in my students, to just be good humans in the world and care about each other and do good things, no matter what kind of technology might be flying at them.
That sounds like a really good place to conclude our podcast. That was well said.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that, wow, what a wonderful encapsulation of what we've been trying to talk about for 19 episodes on this podcast. So thank you so much for that.
You're welcome.
Well, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for joining us. We will be back with another episode soon. We don't know exactly when or where or who, but we will be back. So thanks to our guest, Kristin Arola, and thanks to you, Jim, for organizing it and leading the conversation. So until next time, talk to you later.
This has been the Being Human UT podcast with Dr. Randy Jasmine and Dr. Jim Hindigas. Please follow and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. From Utah Tech University, this is the Being Human UT podcast. This has been a production from a podcast studio.